that is a type of activity that many people wouldn't necessarily call, exercise, okay? So that's where that falls in. Romance or sexual gratification at all, that originally was identified in the original research and in the original writings was only sexual gratification. And he's gone back and looked at some of the data again and said, you know what? It's not just about sex, it is about the emotional connection and connectedness. So sex is a part of it, without a doubt. That's a real driver for a lot of people. But the emotional connectedness is as valuable in many, in many cases. Okay? So, no, I said I've got acute angina. Now, the point being is that if you misunderstand the goal, you may find a large barrier. The barriers can come in a lot of different ways, okay? But the sensitivities can also, okay? And that's what we're going to talk about next. So we've got one person with a goal, okay, him, and her with a sensitivity saying she's not interested. Do you understand how that creates a barrier? All right. So now we're going to talk about the sensitivities under the motives. So basically, anything that's a sensitivity, you're saying, I want to avoid that thing. All right. So the first thing is rejection. That is a universal thing that we have, basically shows that people don't want to be rejected. They want to be accepted. Okay. They want to fit in. They want to belong. Okay. That's very common. But one of the ways that rejection shows up in, especially in adults, is embarrassment. And if they're embarrassed, they translate it as being rejected. Does that make sense? Okay? Adults hate to be embarrassed, but that's a type of fear of being rejected. Now that's why, they say that the number one fear, believe it or not, in the United States is public speaking. People are more afraid of public speaking than they are of dying. So I would rather avoid rejection than avoid death. You understand what I'm saying? So it's like, okay, I would really rather die than to give the funeral memorial for somebody else. I mean, that's basically how that translates. But that's how strong the fear of rejection is. Okay. Physical pain is usually how this is identified. And the reason being is because that physical pain is something that is not categorized, doesn't fit any of the others, okay? The other emotional aspects of it are the issue of frustration, and the language on the assessment talks about the frustration and or seeking self-regulation. So seeking to be able to say, I don't have to be frustrated about this. This is something I can control. Okay, I don't. It's like this morning, would have loved for breakfast to have gone faster. That would have been great, because I could have gotten here on time. And it would have been excellent had I not had to take the rental car back to the airport this morning. Before I came here, it would have been even better had the right address been in the GPS for the airport. You understand? But at some point, you just have to go, I'm not going to be able to be there at 8 o'clock. This is not going to work. So I can either be real frustrated and angry and let the circumstances control my response, or I can be self-regulated and say, I'll do the best I can do, and that's all I can do. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's where that fits. And then there's anxiety, and that roughly translates as extreme fear, but it also can translate into a real disabling level of anxious behavior, where we're talking about a diagnosable condition. Okay. And when we're talking about the opposite of anxiety, then would be to seek calmness. Okay? So when we're working on the assessment, what you will see is that all of those things that are sensitivities that they're trying to avoid, there's a counterpart that says something that they're trying to obtain in the absence of this. Okay? And that's mostly because I strongly believe that assessments should be simple and easy to understand and easy to remember how to do them, mostly because I forget. And so I want to make sure as many of the directions as I possibly can be right in front of me when I'm doing it. So that's why it's on the assessment the way it is. So let me ask you a question, okay? You've got this in front of you. What is that a manifestation of? Avoidance and withdrawal, physiologic arousal, physiologic illness, overactivity, irritability, anger, rage, disorganization of thoughts, stereotypic behaviors, self-stimulation, self-injury, and that shouldn't say self-injury fantasies, that should say self-injury, and then the next line should say fantasies. And I don't know how I actually screwed that up, but I did apparently yesterday when I was revising it, even though I was perseverating on getting it right. All right, so self-injury, and then the next line would be fantasies, and then delusions and hallucinations. Okay? So what does that sound like to you?
Borderline.
Okay, it can sound like borderline personality disorder. Okay? So if you were to see people who were functioning at that level, you might say, wow, they have a borderline personality disorder. And that's not a good thing to have. Because that can ruin your day well into the evening. Borderline personality disorder is one of the possibilities for a description of what that could be. What else? What else might that be?
Bipolar.
Bipolar, yes. Got two people saying it at the same time. Could easily be the manifestation of, especially extreme bipolar, when we're on either end. Because especially among men manifest, typically they manifest depression more as irritability, anger, and rage. That's why men who are really depressed wind up getting into fights so much. Testosterone really screws with the way you manifest stuff. So it's like all these guys, they did the study of guys who were in prison in Michigan. And there's several tests that they use to determine the dexamethasone suppression test and several other things to try and figure out if they're biochemically depressed. And they find out that it's like 87% of the guys who were in the prisons in Michigan were clinically depressed, but they had been physically violent. It's pretty dramatic evidence at that point when you can go, yeah, that's not so good. So that's why I'm saying, even though depression doesn't get said there, but you can see disorganization of thoughts could certainly be a manifestation of depression, right? People who are really depressed start getting kind of get into that stereotypic behavior patterning just to try and maintain stuff, because they don't want to let anybody know that they're coming unglued. Okay, so it's all those kinds of things. All right, what else? What else could it be? Could be schizophrenia. It does kind of sound like it, doesn't it? Especially down there towards the bottom. When you start talking about delusions and hallucinations, yeah, it sounds a whole lot like schizophrenia. Okay, and here's what it really is. It's a progressive manifestation of the symptoms associated with stress. It's a progressive manifestation of the symptoms that are associated with stress. And it is not something that we should be screwing with. So when we say that, oh, he's just stressed, guess what? That's not a good thing. Right? How many times do we hear about the guy who was in the tower, or the son of Sam, or whatever, who wound up shooting and killing? Seemed like the nicest person. He was a little stressed, but it's like the guys at the post office. They were a little stressed. Yeah, and then they wiped out 44 of their colleagues. Okay? So stress is not something to minimize. Again, this is one of those things that people have, because they've heard it so much. It's kind of like, you know, right now, it's like if you watch television for any length of time in any given evening, you assume that everyone has erectile dysfunction. All men have erectile dysfunction. Almost everybody has depression. Because there's at least 2 different, medication ads that are going to come up over the course of the evening for depression. And that stress is normal. And that you're supposed to have, if you're not coping with stress, it's you being weak. Not that your life sucks. So that's part of this equation that we need to keep in the back of our minds. So, I don't know about you, but that looks to me like it might be a little stressful. Okay? And the thing is that when you see extremes of it, it becomes recognizable. But it's like, anybody know how you boil a frog? I'm serious. What's that?
Very slowly.
Very slowly, 1 degree at a time. And if you just keep turning up the heat 1 degree at a time, the frog adapts to it until it cooks. Okay? The reality is that stress raises your cortisol levels. Cortisol levels go up, your belly fat rates go up, your hip weights go up. You wind up with a greater likelihood that you're going to attract and retain trans fats that are going through your system. You're going to clog your arteries. You increase your likelihood that you're going to have a stroke. You increase the likelihood that you're going to have a heart attack. I mean, all of these things are true at a biochemical level for people. And now that we talked about traumatic stress for a long time. We talked about PTSD, right? We've all heard that language. But now what we're talking about is that in the new DSM, they're talking about the sustained stress syndrome. And the people who have been under stress for a long period of time, and they wind up with things like adrenal insufficiency. So it's like their stress levels stay high, and they're like go, 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 and they seem a little hyper, a little anxious, all that kind of stuff, and then all of a sudden they kind of bottom out. And because they got no more adrenaline left. Because the adrenaline was all used up during the day. You see increased levels of epinephrine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, adrenaline in the 24-hour urine collections that are being done among teenagers now. That it used to be that the baseline was down here somewhere, and now it's like 40 to 50% higher than what it's supposed to be. Well, that's because the kids are stressing out. They're really maxing out on stress. Now, I don't know about you, but suddenly drinking and drugs start making a little more sense. Does that make sense? And they're trying to manage with self-medication in a socially acceptable way. Because it's so much better to go get high or go get drunk than it is to say, I think I'm mentally ill. Does that make sense? Being addicted is not nearly as bad as being crazy. Okay? So you got to start thinking about how all these things kind of fit together. So anyway, let's start with stress is a big deal. It's not something to be minimized, so you've got to be careful about anything that we say, it's not that big a deal. It may not be a big deal to you, but it could be a huge deal to them, number one, okay? But there's a pattern that happens, and when you can't figure out how to manage your stress, and by the way, there's an assessment that we have on our website that you guys can have, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but on psychosocial environmental stressors. But the stress levels go up, and what happens is that at some point, you're not able to cope with it. Does that make sense? Okay? And what happens is that then you regress. And you regress to an earlier time, an earlier set of behaviors, an earlier emotional condition when it didn't feel like this. And you try and replicate that because you're trying to get the calm back. Does that make sense? If I can't figure out how to control the stress, maybe I can try and get my calm to come back so I regress in age. So,